in as much as we had two quite different readings last week, this week, two fairly similar readings. They're both about football. And of course, being an English person, when I say football, I'm talking about what many of you might know as soccer. Interestingly, well, and actually the sort of naming of football is something that gets attention a little bit in this article. A bit of background, that not in these articles, but some of you might know that the word soccer, it comes from an abbreviation. Back in the day when football was developing, alongside other types of football, so rugby football was one of them, league football, union football, association football. So association football, it's actually the association part of it that gets sort of shortened into ASOC, right? And then from ASOC turns into soccer. So many Americans know the game as soccer, but as you'll see, it's referred to as football throughout these two articles. So it's about football, but it's more about globalization, right? And so it's about both how football has become globalized, but also how football has led to globalization, right? So the interplay between those two things. Lots of the sort of concepts that you will encounter in these two readings are concepts that really apply and have been applied across globalization. Things like glocalization, right? That's a key concept from both of these readings. Transnationalism, deterritorialization. Deterritorialization, you've had from Appadurai. I believe Appadurai is referenced again in these, right? I said at the beginning that the Appadurai piece that we read it was very influential, and well, I think up to now, almost all of our papers have, except maybe that psychology one, have referred back to the Appadurai piece, and so very influential. But yeah, glocalization, that features heavily in both of these. Let me talk a little bit about what they mean by glocalization, and they explain it quite well in the readings, but let me talk about it a little bit. And it goes back to some of those questions that I asked at the beginning in the introduction video. It goes back to the things, again, that Appadurai was talking about. But the questions being like, hey, is globalization just Americanization? Does it lead to homogenization? Where all of the world, wherever you go, it's the same. And I must have said this before, right? But a piece that we didn't read, but we maybe could have read if we had, maybe I could have put it in that introduction lecture, but was Macworld versus Jihad, right? And that's a Benjamin Barber book. But the idea there, right, is, well, the McDonald'sization, right, of the world, right? The idea that wherever you go, McDonald's is a great sort of meme for this, that wherever you go in the world, you can always get the same, you can go to the same sort of restaurant, decorated in much the same way, and order the same food and get pretty much the same item, right, when you order, and pay roughly the same price. Right, that's obviously a great sort of example of homogenization and globalization that way. Now you can take that too far, and this is really what these two readings. One of the things that it's about, right, is that it doesn't talk too much about McDonald's as I am about to, but it's not just because it's lunchtime, because McDonald's is a very good example of globalization in the ways that we said, but also, I mean, if we look at McDonald's and we look at it more closely, what we'll see is that actually, if you go to a McDonald's in Hong Kong, for example, the way that people interact with a McDonald's restaurant, even though it might look the same superficially, the way that people behave in there is quite different. I'm getting this from a different reading, right? But I'm explaining glocalization here, right? So you've got the homogenization, but at the same time, yes, we're going into a McDonald's. Yes, it looks the same. Yes, there will be different items, right? Depending on if you're in India, if you're in Hong Kong, if you're in the United States, there'll be different items for sale. Some of them are very similar throughout the world, but there's localization. There's some localization of the McDonald's, both in its offerings, but also, again, in the way that people interact. So one thing, and this is something I used to read in a different class that I would teach. I haven't taught it for a little while, but you know, you go into if you go into a McDonald's in Hong Kong, there's not the same sort of conventions about queuing in a certain way. The interaction that you have with the person behind the counter is a little bit different. Like they're usually not smiling at you or being friendly with you, because that's not really like a Hong Kong cultural thing. In fact, like if you smile too much in the McDonald's, if you're a worker in McDonald's in Hong Kong and you smile too much, people think that you're having too much of a good time, right? And not working hard enough, right? And so maybe they think there's some inefficiencies and that they're not getting the best service. Whereas in America, we would expect to go into a McDonald's and you know, and have some sort of reasonably pleasantly polite, which would probably include a smile. Similarly, like it reminds me, I used to work when I was 18. I worked for a summer at the supermarket in England called Tesco. At the time, it was the biggest supermarket. I imagine it still is, if not the biggest, then one of the biggest supermarket chains. And yeah, that's what they taught us, right? I worked on the checkout and they said it was SOS. Yeah, he was. Oh no, that was different actually. Yeah, no, I was going to say it was smile, but the S didn't actually stand for smile. It was say hello, offer help, say goodbye. Right, and so that's that was the thing that we had to remember while we were, you know, working there. But yeah, smiling surely was part of it. I don't know, even if it wasn't in that SOS thing. Anyway, so again, so glocalization is sort of an attempt to capture this. Now, it's maybe easy to see in a McDonald's or perhaps in a supermarket, sort of the similarities and differences, right? And the localization of global concepts, that's only a part of it, right? That's only a part of glocalization, because the other thing is that the global, right? The global can become localized, right? And that I think is a little bit more difficult to comprehend, but luckily we have two readings that are going to focus quite intently on that concept. So have a look at that. You know, how does the global become local, right? And think about it. And this is taken, I think, pretty much from the readings, but kind of gives you a head start on the readings. But think about it, the sort of localization of the global as a collection of localities, a collection of local practices. And in some ways, it goes back to the supermarket idea, right? That we can, when we think globally, when we look at globalization, or when we look at towards, you know, if globalization, and this is another thing that they say, Giulianotti and Robertson, one of the things he says, look, globalization is about looking to the globe, being able to see the world as one united whole. Okay, so and so the sort of cultural supermarket that we were talking about last week, you know, imagine then we're standing there and we're looking. It's probably hard to see all of the aisles at the same time in a supermarket, but imagine you're standing in one aisle, but one really very long aisle, looking down, and all of the different localities are on that aisle, right? And so now what are we looking at? So we're looking at the globe, we're looking at their totality, at one great whole. But that one great whole is made up of all these individual localities, those local customs, those local cultures, local sports, perhaps local football players, and so I'm trying to segue into the football part of this week, are on display all at the same time, right? And so that does become quite clear now if we turn our attention to football. Some of the things it talks about, right, is the worldwide media coverage now that is afforded to football. It doesn't matter almost where in the world that you go, right? There are some teams, and this becomes important, probably the next thing I'll talk about, but there's some teams that you can see wherever you are in the world. What I mean by see is you can watch them play. You can watch them play wherever you are in the world. You can, buy the paraphernalia, the shirts, right, buy the strips of the teams, of some teams at least, right? Barcelona, for example, right? I imagine that there's nowhere on the earth that you can go and guarantee that if you walk around for a couple of days that you won't see a Barcelona shirt, somebody wearing a Barcelona shirt somewhere, right? Perhaps Manchester United to some sort of level would be in a similar category, or Real Madrid. For those of you who are into Spanish football and would get angry if I just mentioned Barcelona without Real Madrid, who are certainly as big, right, as Barcelona. So yeah. So, in that sense, in the worldwide media coverage focused on, at least the Premier League, at least Serie A, the World Cup is talked about in these papers as well, means that teams that are connected to localities, right, which is all of the teams, of course, right, in football, Barcelona, of course, Manchester United, of course, they're connected to some locality, Manchester, right, or Barcelona, London, Berlin, Milan, Rome, Lisbon, Glasgow. Now I'm just naming cities in Europe, but these are cities in Europe that have football teams that are strongly linked, right? That are based there, that have roots there, historical, cultural roots there, that play home games in stadiums that are built in those cities, right? So they're very local, and yet that the localness of them, in all their locality, they're seen on a global stage, right? They're seen globally, right, by fans in Japan, right? It's one of the readings talks about, by fans in North America, right? By fans in the rest of Asia and Australia, right? So again, it's the local. So the glocalization has this idea of the local being seen in a global setting, perhaps, right, alongside lots of other locals. And so another part of the reading sort of gets into that what does make them local and what makes them global, because of course both things have to, for glocalization, which again is the main thing that we're really looking at in these two readings, for both the global and the local are sort of necessary concepts to have. And so if we're going to talk about football clubs and football teams being sort of part of glocalization, we have to sort of identify how are they global and how are they local. And so you'll read one of the papers, and I'm not doing a great job of separating them, partly because they are so similar. They're both written by the same people, and they're both talking about football and they're both talking about glocalization. One of the readings, the second reading, focuses more on sort of comparing football clubs with transnational corporations. And so one of the things that they do is they look at transnational corporations and they say, well, are they really, like, to what extent are these global companies, right? So think of transnational corporations, and so and they use football teams as examples. So let's say Manchester United. To what extent is Manchester United truly global, truly transnational? And they say actually their conclusion is that actually it'd be quite hard for Manchester United to become truly transnational. And what they mean by that, I think, and you can read this for yourself and see what you think, but for me, what I think they mean is that is truly transnational for them means that there's no connection to the local. Right? And of course, what they want to say is that it's actually very difficult. Globalization is not about losing connection with the local. It's not about not being rooted locally or regionally. It's not about that, because that's next to impossible. And they say there's very, very few truly transnational corporations. There are corporations, of course, that exist that operate across the world in different nations. They have part of their supply chain all over the place. They depend on different markets. They might be able to market in specific markets in different ways. They might have that cultural understanding, but ultimately they say almost all of those TNCs, they have a home, right? They have a rootedness in a particular place. They're selling a product that has kind of a connection and a rootedness in a particular country. And it just so happens, right? And so that's, and again, if you follow that too far, right, that, well, these transnational corporations are really American companies, right, or they're really British or German companies or Japanese companies. If you follow that too far, right, then you get back to the Americanization argument. Well, if McDonald's is in Hong Kong, McDonald's is an American company, and so Hong Kong's become Americanized to some degree, and so you have to be, and that's this idea of glocalization, right? It's kind of an anchor there, that if we anchor ourselves to glocalization, we won't go down the Americanization route, right? We won't go down the other route, which is sort of like a completely universal culture as well, right? So this very much is looking at football. So let me talk a little bit about football as transnational corporations. They say, look, yes, Manchester United has groups of fans all over the world. Yes, Asian markets are important to Manchester United. One of the things that the clubs can do, right, in order to boost their profile and increase their revenue, really, right, from audiences around the world, right, is to buy players even, right? Let's buy players from those markets that make people in those markets more feel more connected, right, and more interested. And so think of that for a second, and saying you'll read about this and think about it for more than a second, but think about that for a second. What's going on there? Let's say Everton. So I'm an Everton fan. It's been a long time since I've been to a game. It's been, especially since I've been here. I've lost touch a little bit, but one of the players I remember, sort of from the end of my time watching Everton, like in England, going to the games and things like that, is Landon Donovan, right? Who's an American, very good player as well. Was a pleasure to watch, and did well for Everton, scored goals, which is what you want. But what's going on there? So if Everton sign Landon Donovan, which they did, or if they sign players from anywhere else in the world, why are they doing it, right? And so ostensibly, and one sort of way of looking at it is, look, the best players, are sort of spread all over the world, and so the idea is to get the best players possible and bring them to the club, right? Because we want to do well. And that seems like it would be the case with Landon Donovan. He definitely improved the squad. And the question becomes like, then, well, does Everton start to be less local and more global in that sense, right? Under those conditions. So if Landon Donovan, he's an American, right? And so, he wasn't born in Liverpool, where Everton play, or in the region around about, right? He was quite far away, thousands of miles away. And so to be brought to Everton, does that globalize the team at all? Does it make it more appealing to Americans? And if so, and this is, I think, really what attracts me to this line of thinking, that if that is in fact the case, right, that now more Americans are interested in, it just popped in my head. I think there was a goalkeeper as well, right? We had, and this might have been a little bit more after my time, which is why I don't remember his name super well. We had the American goalkeeper as well for a while. Anyway, but so one of the things they say in the reading is, look, coaches want the best players, and so they might not want to buy players just in order to make themselves more appealing to other countries. But they say, well, but they can do that, right? They could buy a player, they could sign a player that's maybe not going to make it into the first team, but the fact that he's in the squad, right, would draw attention from maybe that player's country, or maybe the region, even like the wider region, like East Asia or something like that. And so, but if that works, as they claim that it does work, right? If that works, that okay, if our team has a player from over there, the people, the fans from over there will now start watching our games, paying money for satellite TV, paying money to our sponsors, buying our merchandise, maybe interacting with the club in other ways, then what part of that is global and what part of that is local, right? Because there's something about this player being local to us let's say even David Beckham getting signed by LA Galaxy, right? And I'm going back, like you can tell that my football knowledge is definitely like a decade or so in the past, and actually these readings are a decade or so in the past as well. But David Beckham coming over to the US, does that make so the fact that makes English people more interested in the MLS soccer, in maybe in LA Galaxy in particular. There's some sort of assumption there that the important thing is the local connection, right? The English connection to LA Galaxy, right? Or the East Asian connection to Tottenham Hotspur or something like that. But the thing that draws us into the global is actually the local, right? And so that's a sort of one of the many examples. There's a lot more examples. So if you're still like wondering about glocalization and what it means, you certainly won't be at the end of these two readings, because they give example after example after example of that. And remember, it's really the sort of the globalization of the local and the localization of the global happening simultaneously and interdependently. For Giulianotti and Robertson, these are not things that we choose, that we can ask a question, well, which is it? Is it more that the global is becoming local, or the local is becoming global? No. And in fact, they claim, right, that the original articles, original sort of scholarship around globalization sort of did one of those two things. And Benjamin Barber talks about this. It's funny that I'm going to talk about Benjamin Barber again, and we haven't read his thing, so maybe next time I'll assign his work. But you can certainly look it up. But one of the things he does is, he has this jihad versus McWeld, so he has sort of a choice, right? Either or, like, are we going to all become homogenized? Right? Are we all going to be McDonald's eating sort of Americanized cultures everywhere in the world, or are we going to go sort of dig down into the roots of our local culture and reject anything that comes from outside, right, from the West in particular? And I remember, like, Benjamin Barber does it in two ways, and see if you notice this in Giulianotti and Robertson as well. As if it seems like globalization literature sort of gives itself over to this, but let me tell you what it is. At first, when I'm reading it, it sounds like he's saying, Benjamin Barber, he's saying these things are happening at the same time. These two processes, this he calls it centrifugal and centripetal. Right? These are centrifugal and centripetal forces. Right? One is like pulling everything in together, and one is like pushing everything out apart. Right? And he talks about them sort of in the beginning. He talks about them going on together, right? And sort of, and certainly Giulianotti and Robertson are on board with that, right? They're like, these things are not happening. It's not one process and another process. This is kind of the same process, which is difficult to do with my hands, right? Because it's going out and coming in at the same time. Anyway, so he starts off like that, and you think, okay, well, it's happening at the same time. It's interdependent. And again, I'm talking about Barber here. But towards the end, what he does is he talks about how he sort of predicts that, look, this jihad side of things, like this, is this centrifugal or centripetal? Centripetal, probably. This localization, right, this interest in our roots, this sort of rejection of global culture that we see in some parts of the world, or in all the parts of the world, but in some sort of subgroups, right, within the world. He says that's a last gasp of local culture. Right? It's a last sort of cry of difference before. I'm almost quoting it word for word here, but like, before, like what does he call it? The endless sleep of globalization, of McWell or something, right? Some sort of boring homogenization is his prediction is about to come. So it's against that, really, that Giulianotti and Robertson are saying, look, these are not either or. This is not like one of them's going to win out here. This is like what glocalization is it's actually both of them happening together. And that's a little bit too simple. I've already given a little bit of a better definition of glocalization, right, in what I've set up to now. And I think, again, I want to just particularly point out the idea that of the global. I think if you read it with this idea in mind, it'll be a good starting point. The idea of like the global being multiple or all localities on display in the same place at the same time. You know, if you think about that happening in a football club, if you think about that in terms of the players, and we've talked about, you know, the players from abroad, players from other regions of the world, are they local or global, right? And is there value about their locality? And of course, it's not their locality to where they are, right? It's not the locality to Everton that's the value, but it's their locality to the United States that's the value, right, in terms of marketing and that sort of thing. Yeah, so think about it in terms of the players. Think about it. It talks about in one of these readings the connectedness, right? And so it talks about how, like, so you can think about it in terms of the individual teams, but you can think about it in terms of the teams as a group, right? That they're playing themselves on a global scale, right? Let's say in European championships, like in the Champions League, for example, that they're playing. And one of the things is, look, there's many more matches between, many more matches in the Champions League today than there was in the European Cup in the 1950s. Right? That's one of the questions on the quiz that I remember. But you know, this is sort of like an example of great connectedness, which we might think of as globalization. But again, right, it's a display of connectedness between localities, right? So when Barcelona play Chelsea, I don't know, when Barcelona playing Chelsea in the Champions League, it's a connection of localities, right? It's this connection between Barcelona and London. Did I say Chelsea? And London. You know, and he talks about as well fans who are traveling over. Watch out for other things. I've spent a lot of time talking about glocalization, and that's as I said, super important. But watch out for like cosmopolitanism. You know, what does that do? So what happens when Manchester United fans go over to Barcelona? What sort of interactions are they having there? And so there's this idea of thin cosmopolitanism and thick cosmopolitanism. And the idea is like thin cosmopolitanism is just, hey, the Manchester United fans are going over to Barcelona and they are finding an Irish pub there in Barcelona, and they're hanging out all together, speaking English, drinking beer, maybe English beer or maybe Danish beer that they drink in England, watching the game. You know, so they might as well just stay at the pub in Manchester, right, for all the cultural difference that exists there. You know, as opposed to, and he gives other examples of other groups of fans as well, the Celtic fans, I think, going to Eastern Europe. Well, and also long-term connections they give between like the ultras. So ultras is kind of a Southern European word, right? But the fanatic fans, right? The very hardcore fans who might be involved in violence. He talks about how in Southern Europe, you know, they might be very involved in politics as well. Might have a similar sort of political background to the clubs that they support. You know, the connection between them is a little bit different from connection between the sort of hardcore hooligan fans of England, for example, of English clubs. But you know, the sort of thick cosmopolitan in connections between those. So although they support different teams, right, and they're in different countries, well, and despite the fact that they're probably quite intensely nationalist in many cases, that they nevertheless share some of the characteristics across borders and boundaries. Well, and not just share the characteristics, that's one part of it, but they also deliberately form connections, right, and deliberately adopt the practices of one another, even though they might on the surface seem a little bit like they might be antithetical to one another. So that's another interesting part of the reading that talks about that. So yeah, they talk about, I think, as I read it properly, and I kept meaning to go back and review this part because it's very stereotypical, I think, but they were saying how like the Italian ultras were taking like the the manner of organization, well, the songs, I guess. So, you know, the thing about the fanatical, the ultras, we'll just call them ultras because that's, I think, the best word, even if it usually refers much more to clubs in Southern Europe than English clubs that I'm going to talk about. But the ultras, you know, they adopt the English ways of singing songs, of gathering in a particular part of the stadium, and that was something that they sort of adopted back in the 70s from the English fans. But later on, the English fans started to adopt, and this is why I think it's stereotypical, right? Started to adopt the dress sense, right, of the Italian ultras, right? The way that they dress in sort of high-end sports gear and that sort of thing. So, yeah, so that's a thicker cosmopolitanism, right? And I think in terms of a quick shorthand, so, you know, what's the difference between thin cosmopolitan and thick cosmopolitanism? I've given examples, but thin cosmopolitanism, think of it as yeah, like we go on more away games now, right? So, but again, right, we're not really being affected by the culture necessarily of the place that we're going to. Right, and also because of technology, global technology like satellite navigation, or you know, Google Maps, right, which is just a super fancy satellite navigation program, I suppose. But you know, because of things like that and the ubiquitousness of cell phones, which it doesn't talk about too much in this, because it's a little bit old, but you know, you can't really get lost anymore. You know. Going abroad to watch a European, you know, like a Champions League game or something, or I was going to say European Cup, but that's well in the past. But you know, going abroad to watch a game between teams from different countries, it doesn't come with the same risk, right? You're not as culturally immersed anymore. You don't have to get a visa anymore. There's very easy means of travel, right? There's 4 planes a day that go to you know, Minsk or something like that from your local airport. And so it's not the same experience, and you might not really have to have a cultural experience to go there. So there's that, and then there's the much more like the long-term relationships between groups of fans of different teams in different countries who are adopting one another's practices. That's more the thick cosmopolitanism. And cosmopolitanism, you know, generally to sort of give some foundation for the thin and the thick that we're talking about is, you know, it comes from the Greek, as they point out in one of these readings, cosmos, which means world, and polis, which you probably know means city. You probably know cosmos as well, but cosmopolitan together, right? It's world, city. And so, but the fact that there's different conceptions of what that world city might be, and again, like, is it you know, the Manchester United fans going over to Barcelona and going to the Irish pub to watch the game and speaking English the whole time? Like, what sort of, you know, that could be one world city, right? You know, a world city sort of divided into neighborhoods where nationalities and cultures don't mix, really, right? They stay in their own neighborhoods, and they talk a little bit about that more generally in the paper as well. So, as a thick cosmopolitanism is like really learning from and adopting long-term those practices that we see in the cultural supermarket, right, to use a term from last week. So, well, I hope I've whet your appetite a little bit. I hope I've set you up a little bit for these readings. I didn't talk too much about deterritorialization. I didn't talk about sort of the ownership and financial support of these football teams. You know, from another thing about this as well, and it came up when I started talking about the ownership of I think it talks mostly about the Premier League, right? So ownership of Premier League teams. Some of this is quite outdated. It's sort of carried on the trends that they're identifying in terms of the foreign ownership of clubs has continued for quite a lot. And so now that, you know, where we are sort of 10, 15 years later is not much different, because it's, again, following those same trends that they're identifying. But it's quite interesting, I think, from my perspective, to sort of read it and say, wow, there's, you know, yeah, that was the case back then, and it's even more the case now. And I think it shows something about the value sort of general value of like academic studies, right? That they can really identify trends that become more and more important as time goes on. And so if you're reading them now, then you've got sort of 10, 15, 20 years to still understand the world, right? As it unfolds sort of in a similar, according to the patterns that they're identifying. So that's a little bit of a shout out to academics, I think, and the benefit of reading these sorts of sources. And that's certainly part of the reason why for the essays and things that you're doing that I like it to look at academic sources. They take I think for me, a much broader long-term view that is useful, not just today or tomorrow or for this month, but is useful, sometimes decades into the future. So anyway, I'm going to end it there, but I'm going to say, do the reading here. I hope that's whet your appetite, and I'll look forward to reading your discussions and what you make of these readings.